All right, welcome everyone to Chapter 5, Adaptations to Anaerobic Training Programs. That can cover a lot of different things. It could cover just resistance training, could cover things like sprint training, both. Both of those types of activities will primarily utilize the anaerobic training, the anaerobic energy systems. So let's define anaerobic training quickly. Should be at a higher intensity. Remember, higher intensity work will use the anaerobic energy systems. Because it is high intensity, it must be done in short or intermittent bouts, which means it cannot be a sustained effort. It should be short in duration. Again, because intensity and duration have what we call an inverse relationship. Right. So again, examples of types of activities that would fall into that category are weight training, plyometric drills, which are explosive activities, and then any speed, agility, or interval training. Okay, all of those would classify as anaerobic training. So the question, just to quickly remind you and review, is what energy systems will these primarily use? Of the three options, phosphocreatine, glycolysis, or the aerobic system. What we're talking about today are activities that are going to stress the phosphocreatine system or the PCR system and the anaerobic system, which is glycolysis. Okay, so we're not talking about the aerobic energy system at all today. So the adaptations that we're going to be talking about as we go through this lecture are going to be in response to high intensity, short duration activities that will primarily stress the anaerobic energy systems, or another way to put that is the energy systems that do not require the presence of oxygen. So let's first start with talking about some neural adaptations. And by that phrase, we're talking about adaptations that are made by the nervous system in response to activity. Okay, so there are several changes that are made that will allow us to be stronger and to be more explosive, independent of any changes to the muscles themselves. Okay, in fact, we usually say that the first phase of adaptations that we see are these neural adaptations that occur. Okay, so the way I like to describe it is you become better able to use the muscle mass that you have. You become more efficient at using that muscle mass, right? Your body learns, you have this motor learning that occurs by practicing whatever the activity is, and you become better at doing that activity, right? We see this as children when we learn how to ride a bike. The first time you tried to ride a two-wheeler, you probably crashed. Or at the best case scenario, you were probably very wobbly on the bike, right? Because your nervous system did not know the proper way, the proper sequence in which to activate your muscles, and therefore your motor unit recruitment was not very smooth, okay? But as you practice that activity day after day after day, eventually you got to the point where you could ride that bike in a very smooth, coordinated fashion. And that was due to the fact that your brain, your nervous system, learned how to activate the muscles in the right sequence at the right time to allow you to perform that activity in a coordinated fashion. So very much the same thing happens with resistance training or sprint training. The first time you do the activity, your brain doesn't really know how to activate your muscles in the right way in order to allow you to do that activity properly. But by continuing to practice the activity, our brains, our nervous system learns the proper sequence of muscle activation, becomes more synchronized, which means it occurs in more of a coordinated fashion, and we become stronger, or we become faster, or we can jump higher simply because our brain now knows what it's doing, to put it very simply. Okay, so some specific things that we see is, I mentioned the reflexes that we talked about in a previous lecture. They become more coordinated as well. The stretch reflex is enhanced by using it, and on which you all may remember the stretch reflex increases force production. On the other hand, the Golgi tendon organ reflex, which we said inhibits force production, the effects of the Golgi tendon organ are reduced through training. So we gain stimulation, we lose inhibition. The combined effect of that is greater rates and levels of force production. We could divide these into central and peripheral adaptations. Remember that whenever we use the word central, we're talking either about the central nervous systems, we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so we do see some changes in the central adaptations. So specifically, your motor cortex, part of the outer layer of your brain, that is the area that really experiences learning. So by practicing the activity, your motor cortex is going to learn the proper ways to stimulate the rest of the nervous system, and then in turn the muscles to coordinate that activity, right? So that level of adaptation does not just occur in the brain, but also can descend into the spinal cord as well, and that's what we're talking about, these cortico-spinal tracts, okay? Ultimately, then, the nerves that exit the spinal cord, that transitions us into what we call the peripheral nervous system, which are the nerves that actually come into contact with the muscles, right? And that brings us to the second bullet point. We do see adaptations there as well. And these adaptations are a lot of what I was describing with the whole riding a bike analogy. So, increase in recruitment of muscles, muscle fibers, motor units that are needed to perform the activity. That's one thing. The rate of firing of those motor neurons increases. That's going to allow for greater force production and also more rapid force production. Synchronization of firing. So rather than, let's just say we have two motor units and they're firing one, they're kind of firing back and forth. Now they're firing at the same time. They're synchronized. Again, that's going to increase the level of force production and the rate, which is the speed of force production, right? And then ultimately all of those factors are going to combine to increase force production and rate of force production. And I'm going to keep using those terms over and over again, because those are really the most important things, and those translate to performance of any activity. Produce more force kind of correlates to strength. Rate of force production, how fast you can produce force, that correlates to power. Typically in most athletic activities, strength and power are going to be the most important components of fitness related to success and the participation in that activity, okay? So this neural adaptation process very much can improve strength and power. Now, okay, what are the best ways to put the stress on the nervous system to promote those things? Well, high intensity really is what really provokes the biggest change, right? The higher the intensity, the greater the level of stress will be on the body. The greater the level of stress, the more pronounced the adaptations will be, okay? So with regards to resistance training, the heavier the load, the more motor units there will be required to overcome that load, okay? And that's going to force these neural adaptations that we just talked about, right? If you're lifting, a very light load on a bench press, you will see some neuromuscular adaptation, but not to the level that you would if you were lifting a near maximal load, right? By lifting that very heavy load, you're forcing your brain to adapt and to begin using more motor units, and that is really what translates to this motor unit recruitment. Okay, so heavy resistance is one way, and or the speed of the movement, which is not highlighted here in red, but equally important. Moving things rapidly, again, places a greater stress on your nervous system, and that's going to promote a greater level of adaptation, right? So think about jogging versus sprinting. Jogging is going to place less stress on your nervous system. Sprinting is going to place more. sprinting is going to improve muscular power, and it's going to have some effect on muscular strength as well. So the more intense the stimulus, the greater the result will be in terms of the adaptations that develop. We've talked about this before in lecture, but just remember that as the force production needs increase, the size of the motor units are going to increase, right? If you're only producing low levels of force, you're only going to stimulate these small motor units, okay? But to really get stronger and faster, we need to stimulate really all of them, but especially the big ones. Therefore, we need high levels of force production. And again, that kind of takes us back to lifting heavy loads is going to promote the greatest level of this neural adaptation that we're talking about. Other changes at the neuromuscular junction, that's where the nervous system sort of comes into contact with the muscular system. That communication is done using neurotransmitters, chemicals, okay? And again, part of this adaptation process is there is more efficient communication between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber at the level of this neuromuscular junction. So all of these factors that we talked about, stress is placed on them by high intensity exercise, and then adaptation occurs due to that stress being placed on them. And all of the factors combine then to make us stronger and faster. Just a couple other quick things to mention that's interesting. These are more specific, but cross-education means that, if you only train one limb, there is going to be some crossover to the other limb as well, which really shows us that there is neural adaptation occurring. If it was just muscular adaptation, the injured side would never improve, but we have seen during studies where we have an injured limb, arm or leg, and the person trains the non-injured side, there is some improvement in strength in the injured side, right? So that shows us that we have what they call here cross-education, or a bilateral deficit, which means that both limbs together can produce more force than either side independently when it's added together, okay? A good example of that is like a dumbbell bench press versus a barbell bench press. Now, I'm just going to use an example. Let's say that for me, when I do dumbbell bench press, the most I can do is, let's say, 50 pounds in each hand, right? So it's only 100 total pounds. But when I'm doing the barbell, I can do 185, okay? So that's an example of the bilateral deficit. Stronger bilaterally, which is both arms working together, versus the arms working independently as they would during a dumbbell bench press when those loads are added together, okay? That is another example of neural adaptation at work, okay? So let's now turn to the muscular adaptation. Probably more what you think about when you think about the body responding to anaerobic exercise training. So we'll see several things that we are going to go through here in terms of the size of the muscle changing, the fiber type transition that occurs, and then are there any biochemical or structural changes as well. And just to give away the conclusion, yes, all of those things change, and the result then is, as you might expect, enhanced strength, power, and endurance. So let's start with growth, okay? The term that we use to describe growth of a muscle is hypertrophy, okay? Hypertrophy means that the diameter of something is going to increase, okay? Or another word that you see on the slide here is the cross-sectional area, okay? It's not getting longer, it's becoming thicker, so the diameter, the area around it is growing, okay? And that is done primarily by adding more protein, specifically the contractile proteins. Okay, and the main two contractile proteins, as you might remember, are actin and myosin. Okay, so again, when a muscle is placed under habitual stress, as it would be when you're participating in a resistance training program, your body responds to that stress by adding more contractile protein. Now, the reason it's doing that is to make the muscle stronger, but the side benefit of that is the muscle also gets larger, right? And if you think about it, do larger muscles always equate to stronger muscles? And I would say that the answer is basically yes, right? Because force is generated by these individual proteins coming into contact, contracting, relaxing, right? So the more proteins you have, the greater the ability will be for force generation. So therefore, we could say a larger muscle typically is going to be a stronger muscle. Now, I say typically because you also have that neural component as well, okay? So you might have a well-trained individual with smaller muscles versus an untrained individual who just has naturally large muscles, and the trained person could be stronger, but that's because they also have the neural adaptations. So that's why I gave that typical response, right? In exercise physiology, very few things are either yes or no, black or white, on or off. Usually there's some gray area that does exist, and this is an example of that, okay? But typically a larger muscle is going to be a stronger muscle because that larger muscle will have more contractile protein and therefore more force can be generated. Now, a term you might see sometime is hyperplasia. What that refers to is an increase in the number of fibers. It is generally agreed upon that humans do not experience hyperplasia with the exception of when there is an injury. Okay, humans' muscles get stronger by increasing the size of the existing fibers, not by adding more fibers. The only time that has been found to occur is in the case of an injury where maybe muscle has been lost and that muscle fiber is replaced. As far as structural changes go, not only do we increase protein concentration in the muscle, but all of the support structures that promote muscle contraction, those are going to increase in concentration as well. So sarcoplasmic reticulum, T-tubules, remember those are the things that store and distribute calcium into the muscle fiber. There's no point in adding protein if we don't also have ways to facilitate the use of that protein. Therefore, we do have to increase these, what I would call support structural components of the muscle as well, right? Because the more T-tubules and sarcoplasmic reticulum we have, the more calcium that can be released, and again, that could promote greater levels and rates of force production, okay? Things that we see here are other adaptations that occur in response to anaerobic exercise, right? Now, here's where we see sort of a split between aerobic and anaerobic adaptations. Aerobic adaptations make a muscle better at aerobic exercise. Anaerobic exercise makes muscles better at anaerobic exercise. Okay, so these things that we see here are going down because these are aerobic characteristics, right? And your muscle has to sort of make a trade-off at a certain point. You either want to go aerobic or anaerobic. If you're going anaerobic, we got to reduce some of the aerobic machinery, and that's what we're looking at here, okay? On the other hand, if we were doing aerobic adaptations, which we will do later, another chapter, these things might go down, these things might go up, right? So this is sort of like the example of it's an either or type of situation. Changes in the enzyme activity, that's going to refer to glycolytic enzymes, right? Because we're relying mostly on glycolysis for these activities, the enzymes that are part of glycolysis are going to increase in concentration to allow glycolysis to occur at a faster rate and therefore provide us with ATP to fuel this increased force production and rate of contraction. Key point. Hypertrophy is associated with increased contractile protein concentration. That is what is going to lead to a muscle growing, and one factor that leads to it becoming stronger. Another muscular adaptation that we might see is a transition in fiber type, okay? Now, because type 2 fibers typically have, those are the fibers that are used to generate high levels of force. Those are the ones that are going to be more likely to gain contractile protein. Therefore, they're going to be more apt to grow in size versus your type 1 fibers, okay? Now the transition, this is what's going to be more likely to happen, is that the way that you train is going to sway your muscle fibers one way or the other, okay? So you have type 1 and type 2 are kind of your two broad categories, type 1 being aerobic, type 2 being anaerobic, type 1 being slow, type 2 being fast, etc. Type 1 having high fatigue resistance, type 2 having low fatigue resistance. What we see with response to training is your type 2 fibers become more fatigue resistant. Okay, so what the transition that we see typically is this shift towards your type 2X fibers, which are the most explosive, least fatigue resistance. They're going to shift more towards what we would call a type 2A fiber, right? Which type 2A still can produce high levels of force, but it has better fatigue resistance than the type 2X, okay? So it's almost like, you know, I've read books where people have referred to the type 2A as like a super fiber because it's like the best of both worlds, can produce a lot of force and also resist fatigue, where the two fiber types on the outside of this continuum, 1 and X, that's kind of like the either or, where the type 2A is like the best of both worlds. Okay, so what we see with regards to anaerobic training, fiber type tends to shift from type 2X, to type 2A. Again, allowing those explosive fibers to gain fatigue resistance. So that's a positive adaptation for sure, right? Ideally in life, it'd be great if we only had these, but that's not the way it works. So I'm pretty sure there's a question that you're asked maybe in the critical thinking assignment, really regarding this point in red here. And I'm not going to give you away the total answer because I want y'all to think about it and just explain to me why you think this occurs. All right, moving on. Let's talk. I'm going to kind of move through this pretty rapidly because this is, you know, maybe a little bit of a lesser important topic in this chapter overall. But I think it is worth noting why it occurs, right? Muscle growth is great, but if the thing that the muscle attaches to doesn't also grow, then you're setting yourself up for injury, right? So muscles attach to bone through tendons and ligaments. So if the muscle is going to grow, a bone also needs to become stronger, and then the connective tissue that combines those two things needs to become stronger as well, right? You can't transmit a ton of force through this big muscle on a small bone or through weak connective tissue because the connective tissue could rupture, the bone could break. Now, those are worst case scenarios, I know, but the logic still follows, right? That if muscles increase in size, connective tissue needs to get stronger and bones need to get thicker. Okay, so what we're looking at here is, you know, telling us that anaerobic training does promote bone remodeling, which means bones are going to be sort of the tissue of the bones is going to be recycled and remodeled and become stronger and thicker, right? Weight-bearing exercise, load-bearing exercise promotes that. So that's why it's important to be on your feet for training, because transmitting force through your bones is going to promote this bone remodeling. And then likewise, the connective tissues, the tendons, the ligaments, the fascia, the mechanical force transmitted through those tissues during high intensity training is also going to promote adaptation of these tissues as well, right? So if we're looking at, this is an example of a ligament. The collagen fibers are going to undergo remodeling, and their matrix, which is kind of shown here, is going to be remodeled, and what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be made more fluid in terms of it's going to be better able to withstand force and better able to transmit force. Okay? If you look at like this weaving effect that occurs here, sorry, I keep going the wrong direction. The more tightly this is woven and the thicker, the more strands there are, that's going to lead to a stronger tendon able to transmit more force. So again, high intensity exercise is going to promote the adaptation of these connective tissues as well. What's a good example of this, right? You might have heard of like maybe your parent, your uncle, your aunt, somebody you know, they haven't been physically active for a long time, and then they decide to go out and play a game of pickup basketball, and they blow out their Achilles tendon. And that's just because due to the lack of stress placed on those tendons, it has become weak. And then suddenly there's all this force placed on it, it ruptures. Okay, where participation in regular physical activity is going to keep those connective tissues not only strong, but also pliable as well, which is very important. That's going to help us to resist injury. So these are some specific bullet points that I sort of broadly described. So I'm going to skip through those in the interest of saving time. Cartilage, I did not mention, but again, cartilage is sort of like a sponge within our joint that should be pliable, right? Lack of activity causes that sponge to dry out and harden and become more likely to be injured, but compression and relaxation of that sponge forces it to stay soft. And that's how it should be for healthy tissue. Okay, so again, cartilage is not technically connective tissue, but it also gets stimulated to be healthier, for lack of a better word, through participation in this physical activity. And really all of the stuff that I've just mentioned in these last few slides is the major benefit is what? Injury prevention, right? And that's the key thing. Because if your muscles just get big, but your connective tissues and bones don't adapt, you're more likely to be injured. But by stressing the muscles, these other tissues are going to respond and adapt as well. So here's, again, weight-bearing exercise is important for particularly bone and cartilage, but also for tendons and ligaments as well. Now, you can scale weight-bearing activity, right? A young, healthy person can do heavy resistance training, high-intensity plyometrics. An older adult, they're still going to benefit from weight-bearing activity. You just might need to scale it back, right? Reducing the load on like a back squat, or instead of having them do squat jumps, they're doing skips. Skips and squat jumps are both plyometrics. They're both heavy load-bearing activities. Skipping is just much lower intensity than a squat jump, right? A skip is a great plyometric to introduce to older adults to start to stimulate some of this connective tissue adaptation that we talked about earlier, while keeping them safe from injury. All right, endocrine system we just covered last week, so I don't know that we really need to spend too much time on this. We can just kind of review the fact that, remember, the intensity of the effort is really the most important thing. So the heavier the load, or the more rapid the contraction, and by that I'm kind of envisioning sprinting, the greater the hormonal response will be, specifically of the anabolic hormones. Remember, anabolic is building up. Testosterone is the chief anabolic hormone. High intensity activity will increase that hormone concentration, but also, as we said last week, will increase the number of receptors available which the hormones can bind to. And that's going to be important for promoting these adaptations that we kind of spoke about, right? So that those adaptations that we talked about in the muscular system a few slides ago are enhanced when there is a potent hormonal stimulus from testosterone, etc. So not only do we see an acute increase in hormonal concentration from one training session, but habitual training leads to chronically elevated hormonal concentrations. Chronically just meaning long term. That's something I should have pointed out to you all the first lecture. I use those terms a lot. Acute means in the moment. So acute response to exercise is increased heart rate. Chronic response to exercise is reduced heart rate, right? Chronic response more refers to adaptation. Acute response refers to what is happening while you're doing the activity. Okay, so chronically, in response to training, hormonal concentrations will rise. However, the longer you train, they're going to sort of plateau out, right? It's not like you can keep training and your hormonal concentrations keep going up and up and up. Eventually, you're going to reach a level of plateau or a ceiling based upon your genetics, mostly. All right, let's talk a little bit about cardiovascular responses. So even though we're not relying on the aerobic energy system, there is still going to be a stress on our cardiovascular system and our respiratory system during this type of activity, right? And I'm sure you've all noticed that when you go and sprint, you're out of breath, your heart's pounding. That's showing you that these systems are under stress during those activities, okay? What do we want to look at here? So acute anaerobic exercise, which means, again, while you're doing it, will result in increased cardiac output. That's how much blood is pumped out of your heart per minute. Stroke volume, how much blood is pumped out per heartbeat. Heart rate is your beats per minute. Oxygen uptake is your VO2, or how much oxygen your body is consuming by minute. And then systolic blood pressure should increase with exercise intensity. And then lastly, blood flow to active muscles is going to increase because those muscles are active. They're demanding oxygen. They're also producing waste products that need to be taken away. Therefore, during exercise, we're going to divert more blood to our muscles and divert it away from our less metabolically active tissues, which during exercise typically is going to be digestive system, your liver, etc., kidneys. As far as adaptations go, there is little change in these variables. These variables are more affected by aerobic exercise because often it's thought that it takes a sustained effort to provoke changes in the cardiovascular system. However, there is one change that occurs, and that's that the heart can increase in size, okay? Intensity, let me think about this for a second. Cardiovascular exercise produces a volume overload on the heart, okay, where high intensity exercise promotes an pressure overload on the heart, okay? Think about when you're deadlifting, you're doing that Valsalva maneuver, you're holding your breath while you're kicking that weight up. That produces a lot of pressure in your thoracic cavity and in your heart, okay? That then, doing that habitually through training promotes changes to the heart from a tissue perspective, right? The heart can increase in size because you're producing more contractile protein in the heart, much like we saw with skeletal muscle. Similar thing can occur in the heart muscle. And that has an effect, right? The larger the heart is in terms of having more muscle mass, the stronger, the more forceful the rate of contraction will be. And that will promote an increase in stroke volume. The more forceful the heart contracts, the more blood that is ejected per heartbeat. Other adaptations to mention, we do tend to see, because of that increase in stroke volume that occurs with the heart increasing in size, heart rate would be reduced. Okay, that's the trade-off. The more blood you pump out per beat, the less beats you need per minute to get that amount of blood out that the heart needs, or that the body needs. So chronically, resistance training can reduce the cardiovascular response to that activity. And again, that's because stroke volume has gone up. You're pumping out more blood per beat. Therefore, the heart rate goes down because it compensates. Okay. We tend to see the same thing with ventilation, right? Ventilation will either be unaffected or be moderately improved, which means that your breathing rate will not go up as high after training as it did before training, because your body becomes more efficient at utilizing the oxygen that it has, so you don't have to bring as much in. Okay. Also, there's less disruption to homeostasis than there was before. So there's less waste product to get rid of, less oxygen is needed to restore homeostasis. So again, ventilation rate typically could be reduced slightly as a result of an anaerobic training program. Aerobic capacity, so that's your VO2 max, that's typically not affected by anaerobic exercise, although there is some, a lot of people think now there is some benefit to it. It's a small change, right? So 5 to 8%, that's not a huge difference, where aerobic exercise could result in like a 30% increase. It's a minimal increase with resistance training. But the way that you structure your resistance training could affect that, right? So if you do more of like a circuit training based training where you're having low rest periods, constant movement, that's going to produce a stronger stress on the cardiovascular system and could result in a greater increase in VO2 max, versus if you're taking very long rest periods, less stress is applied to the cardiovascular system, lower response in your VO2 max adaptations. So the rest period length really becomes key when you're talking about how resistance training affects VO2 max. Now, what about combining both types of training? This is an interesting topic, I think, because a lot of us, you probably like to do both, right? You like to lift weights and do some cardio at the same time. The conclusion is the effect on your aerobic capacity is not huge, but the effect on your muscular strength could be pretty negative. So if you're doing both types of exercise together, you're going to sort of limit your ability to gain muscular strength, okay? Because kind of as I said earlier, the adaptations are either or. You can't adapt optimally to both, because eventually your body has to make a trade-off. Are we going to have a lot of contractile protein, or are we going to have a lot of mitochondria, right? You can't have both. It's going to be one or the other, right? So if you want to be stronger, you need more contractile protein, less mitochondria. If you want to have greater aerobic capacity, you need more mitochondria, less contractile protein. So the thing that really loses out if you're doing both forms of training together is muscular strength. So the take-home point is, if muscular strength is of utmost importance to you for your sport, you should limit your aerobic exercise somewhat to not allow that interference effect to harm your ability to get stronger, okay? If you're just a recreational athlete who wants to be in good shape, you should do both. It doesn't really matter. But if you're college athlete, pro athlete, whatever, working with an athlete of that sort, and getting strong and powerful is super important for them, then you might want to limit the aerobic activity while they're training for their sport to allow them to maximize their muscular strength or muscular power. So what are some limiting performance improvements? So as I've mentioned before in class, your level of training going into a program really affects your ability to adapt. If you're untrained, strength can improve greatly, okay? But if you're already very well trained, like an elite athlete, your strength is not going to improve much, because we all have this sort of ceiling over us, right? I'm going to get low so you can see this. If I'm untrained, then I have a lot of room between my head and my ceiling. But if I'm already well trained, then my head is already very close to my ceiling. So you need to consider that, okay? For people's ability to improve in any fitness component, the more well-trained they are, the lower their improvement rate is going to be. The less trained they are, the greater the rate of improvement will be, okay? In any case, though, the most effective way to get stronger is, as we said earlier in this lecture, heavier loads. Heavier loads going to stimulate more motor units, And that's going to promote greater level of adaptation across the board with everything we talked about today. Just be careful with untrained people. Start low with the intensity, get higher. And with older adults especially, you need to maybe avoid super intense activity with those populations, older, untrained populations. As far as power goes, I've already touched on this a little bit. Strength is the ability to exert force. Power is the ability to exert force with speed. Okay, so how rapidly can you produce force? In a lot of sports, power is the most important variable, right? In football, you need it. When the ball snapped, you got to get off that line fast and hit somebody or get away from the defender to catch the ball. You need to be able to exert force with speed. Okay, when you're kicking a soccer ball, same thing. You got to be able to kick that ball fast to get it past the goalie, whatever, right? Most sports require power. In order to be powerful, you need to train powerfully. So this is a quote that I added, which I think sums it up pretty well. If you want to be fast, you got to train fast. If you train slow, you're going to be slow. Okay, so for athletes, in most cases, it's advantageous to train fast because in your sport, you need to be fast. So when you're lifting or doing plyometrics, those movements need to be done explosively because that's going to translate to having more muscular power on the field. Okay, it kind of shows you here. Peak power output is achieved at a fairly low percentage of your 1 rep max. So you should still lift heavy, but for your plyometric training, you need to use lighter loads so you can use those loads as explosively or as fast as possible. This is for lower body. This is the percentage for upper body, right? So when you're doing a bench press, to get stronger, you need to be close to 100% of your 1 rep max. That's going to help, but to get faster, you need to use a much lower percentage of your 1 rep max and move that load as fast as you possibly can. As far as muscular endurance goes, there's not going to be a ton of improvement there with anaerobic exercise, but there will be some because, kind of jumping back to the muscle fiber typing discussion we had earlier, through training, your muscle fibers develop better fatigue resistance. Okay, so that is going to translate to better muscular endurance. Okay, you're going to have a more efficient energy system. Some of these are kind of antagonistic to what we saw earlier because we said mitochondria would go down, capillaries would go down. It really depends on the type of training that you're doing, okay? Technically, like running the 400 is going to make you stronger and faster, but you also have to be able to sustain that high intensity activity for, 60 seconds or so, let's say. Maybe 45, maybe 30 if you're fast, I don't know. So there's going to be some carryover to, you're going to need to be able to sustain that activity, so you might see some improvement in your mitochondria or capillaries, right? Versus if you're doing the 50-yard dash only, there's no need for endurance. You would not see improvements in these things at all. Okay, so it really depends upon the length of the activity that you're doing. That's going to really determine the degree to which muscular endurance improves. If your sport requires some endurance and you train that way, your endurance will improve. But if your sport does not require endurance, then you will not train that way, and therefore muscular endurance would not improve. Body composition, just to finish up a few last variables here. A lot of people think that resistance training and anaerobic exercise in general is the best way to lose body fat. So just in general, resistance training has been found in research studies to reduce body fat percentage from 1 to 9%. Okay, so 9% is pretty significant. That has occurred through increasing lean tissue mass, increasing muscle mass. Lean muscle mass would increase your metabolic rate, which would increase your overall energy expenditure throughout the course of the day. And a lot of that resting energy expenditure, you would be using fat as fuel. That fuel source would be your stored body fat. Okay, so that's kind of like the logical progression of how this would occur, right? So the best way to lose body fat is to get stronger, get more muscle mass. the effect is going to be not immediate. So you need to be patient, but long term, there's going to be a much larger benefit, and you're going to be able to sustain that body fat loss versus if you just do a crash diet. You might lose a lot right away, but it's all going to come back once you get off the crash diet. So getting stronger, getting more muscle mass is a great way to lose body fat. And for athletes, of course, that's often a big goal, is to reduce body fat percentage. Injury rates drop when body fat percentages are lower, and overall strength performance typically correlates positively with lower body fat percentages. Flexibility, may improve, depends on where you're coming from, right? If you're inactive and you become active, moving your muscles through a full range of motion is going to improve mobility and flexibility, okay? However, packing on more muscle mass can reduce flexibility. So in that case, it's going to become important to do, regular stretching, particularly after a session. The more muscle mass you have, the tighter that tissue is going to get. So it's going to need to be targeted or intentionally stretched in order to retain or improve flexibility, okay? Let me see how many more slides we have here. We're almost finished. All right, so last topic on this is motor performance. A lot of this goes back to how I opened this lecture talking about riding a bike, right? When you first try to do an activity, your body's not going to be very good at it. You're going to be uncoordinated. But the more you practice it, the more efficient your body's going to be at doing the activity. It's going to be much more smooth. It's going to require less energy. All of these activities listed here would follow into that category. And what this slide is showing us is not only that doing the activity improves performance, but resistance training will also improve the performance of all these activities as well. Because you're using muscles, they're getting stronger, they're getting more efficient. And then when you're practicing that activity using those stronger and more efficient muscles, the performance of that activity is going to increase. Okay, so pretty much all athletes are going to benefit from some level of resistance training, without a doubt. All right, the last topic I'm going to go through quickly, very quickly, is overtraining. Okay, this is not as much of an issue as it's made out to be, in my opinion. But what this is saying is, if you don't work rest in, if you overdo it for a prolonged period of time, you're going to reach a state where your body starts to fail to adapt, and you're going to actually have decreased adaptation, and performance then is going to start to decline as well. Okay, there are many factors that can lead to this. So excessive frequency, so not taking days off, excessive volume, so doing too much in one session, or always working out at 100% intensity. That's also very neurologically taxing and can result in extreme fatigue, illness, injury. These things are due to lack of rest, lack of recovery, especially if you're not taking in adequate nutrients. That can have a big negative impact as well, okay? In a short term, this can be called overreaching. Overreaching is important, but overreaching needs to be followed by a period of recovery. If you continually overreach, eventually you're going to progress into this syndrome that is called overtraining syndrome, okay? So again, overreaching is good, but overreaching should be done for a finite period, and then you should have a period of recovery. If you don't do the recovery and you continue to overreach, overtraining is going to pop in. So here we see just some sort of symptoms. I'm not going to go through these because I just don't want to spend a lot of time on this now. If you're interested in this topic, I would highly recommend that you read these slides and we read the section of the book. In strength and conditioning, we counter this by using periodization. That's why we use periodization, which is a topic we're going to cover in detail later in the semester. Periodization forces us to manipulate the variables and then ultimately rest at the end of the cycle. One of the reasons that we do that is to prevent the development of overtraining, okay? You can't train balls to the wall year round. If you do, you're going to reach this state of maladaptation, right? We have to recover. Our body improves and grows and gets better during recovery. If you don't allow recovery, the body's not going to get better, and eventually you're going to make it sick and injured. Okay, so that's what we want to avoid. That's why we use periodization. Here are some symptoms, right? So if you notice any of these things, especially things like mood disturbances, sleep disturbances, increased risk or increased illness, colds, respiratory infections, etc., increased heart rate and blood pressure, those can be symptoms of overtraining. So that's should cue you that it's time to back off. Okay. You know, say that you used to love training and now all of a sudden you hate it. That is telling you something. If you lose joy from exercising, just take a break, right? Now, maybe if you're an athlete, you can't, but I'm sure that your coaches, your strength and conditioning coaches, your sport coaches, they're going to work in periods of recovery, off days, etc., to prevent this staleness. Like this, a good way to describe this is staleness. Staleness can lead to overtraining. Staleness is your brain telling you something, telling you to take a break. All right. So if you're experiencing that and you are an athlete in a structured program, just talk to your coach about it. And I'm sure he or she will have a strategy to work with you on how to avoid going down that negative road. Okay. Now, a big question is, if I take a break, am I going to lose my gains? Okay, so detraining can occur. Typically, though, you can retain cardiovascular improvements, especially for 2 weeks before you start to see any decline in your adaptation. So if you're sick and you have to miss a week of training, don't stress about it. You're not going to lose your fitness. You have at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. With resistance training based adaptations, it's about the same. And the key variable for limiting the loss in gains with resistance training adaptations is intensity. So drop the volume down, keep the intensity high, and that will help you maintain strength, muscle mass, and power, right? Intensity is the most important thing for retention of gains versus volume. Volume might get you there, but intensity will help prevent effects due to detraining. And again, I'll reiterate this. You have about 2 weeks before you start to see any loss at all. So if you have to take a week off, don't stress about it. Just do it, get better, and come back ready to train freshly after that week to 2 weeks. Okay, so that wraps it up. The tasks, as usual, we have our study questions, our critical thinking assignment. We also have an exam this week. It will not cover this chapter. It's only going to cover chapters 1 through 4. I will make an announcement about that separately and give you some information on the test. All right, so that's it. I'll talk to you all next time.